So now to the original question, built-in quality. What kind of metrics should we be tracking? A lot of people ask me which of the metrics we're tracking now should we continue to track. I say just don't even think that way. Scrap all that. We'll start from scratch. The first one's code coverage. But again, that one gets misused a lot. Everybody knows and probably has experienced where you have a library of unit tests, and you look at some of them and they're not really even testing the functionality that they say they're testing. No, it's useless. It looks good because you've got a passing test every time you run them, but it's not an honest representation of the quality of your code. Again, testing should be about exposing accurately and reporting accurately the current state of the system. If that test isn't doing that, it's not a good unit test. And sometimes those are hard to find. Sometimes the developer thinks they are actually testing the right thing. They couldn't figure out how to do it any other way, so they just did it that way, but it's not really testing it well. And the other developers, when they reviewed it, just wanted to make sure there are unit tests. They didn't really pay a lot of attention to how good the unit tests are. So code coverage can be, inaccurate. Then you also have some unit tests where it just simply says pass. It just assert true. Again, just to get a good number. They've been told they have to hit 85%, so they do whatever they can to hit 85%. So when it comes to code coverage, my recommendation is don't set a percentage for the organization. Let your teams strive for those high percentages. They will. They'll look at what other people are doing there, and people are going to be asking, why aren't you guys there? So they'll figure that out. Okay. Just make sure everybody is measuring it and reporting it. Make sure it's up somewhere where the team can see it and other people can see it, what their code coverage level is. So code coverage is a good metric used correctly. It doesn't necessarily say that the tests are good and that the system is working exactly the way it's expected, but done well, it's a reliable metric. Percentage of merges into the developed branch that include code changes to both the testing and the system code. That is not necessarily a 100% accurate indicator of a team and an individual applying the practice of test-driven development, but it is a reasonable metric of quality. It's reasonable to assume that they are using test-driven development if every merge includes changes to both the system code and the testing code. There's a lot of times you won't be making changes to both, legitimate reasons why. But at least if you measure it, you can see how you're doing as a team. They have the ability to then improve if you're measuring that type of thing. So sometimes that's a tricky metric to pick up, but that's a good metric. Is the percentage of code changes, the percentage of merges into develop that include changes in both the system code and the test code, both unit testing and integration testing, by the way. All that code should be in the same repository, but in that one repository, they shall be there. So you should be able to get a report each time about the code that's changed in the system code and the unit test code and the integration test code. The rate at which merges are being made into the develop branch is a reasonable, again, not 100% accurate, but a reasonable indicator of continuous integration. I find it very disappointing that most times when I'm doing a screening of an individual and I ask them for their definition of continuous integration, they immediately go to the remote build process and the pull request and automatically does all that and goes out through Jenkins. That and the tooling itself is not continuous integration. Let me repeat that. Jenkins or any remote build and deployment system is not an indication, is not an implementation of continuous integration. Continuous integration is not tooling. It is a practice. It's how a developer goes about his work. It's not the tools he uses. You could do continuous integration. In fact, I do. You could do continuous integration without any tooling. Continuous integration is implementing small iterative changes to the code that still pass all the unit tests and merging that in. You're continually updating the code with the code base with code that could go to production. It's not going to blow things up. Features may not be complete, but we didn't break anything. Small, iterative changes to the code. Some companies, that's 25 to 50 merges a day. That's well tested. That's continuous integration. That type of behavior. It's not the tool set. So a reasonable way to measure that is the number of merges per day or whatever period of time. Number of merges into the develop branch gives you an idea of whether you guys are doing a reasonable job of continuous integration. This is measurements of quality again. Now these are metrics around the quality of how we do what we do. It's not inspection metrics of the software itself or metrics around how well we're doing at inspection. This is metrics around how well we're building the software. Another metric is being able to tell percentage-wise how many of our deployed builds are testable. Really, you can do that with smoke tests. Smoke test is used in a lot of different ways, a lot of them not helpful. They're still related to inspection, not quality. What we want to know in testability is, are all of the web application and web service endpoints responding and returning everything that we're going to be verifying in all the other tests that we have? So just a small number of tests, but it's making sure, I put it this way, making sure the lights are on and everybody's home. That's what you want to know with your smoke test. Are the lights on? Is everybody home? So getting a report of that, you can then use that report to say, okay, what's our percentage of testable builds that are going to the first environment? Usually that's called the dev environment, the shared dev environment. How many percentage of testable builds that are going out there? The other metric to look at, or another measurement, is the number or percentage of acceptable builds being deployed to that same environment. Now, acceptable builds is determined by all the acceptance tests passing for the user stories we are currently working on in this iteration. I just want to know if the user stories that we're currently working on, we're still passing all the acceptance tests. I don't want to break something that's currently in development. And so that report tells us whether that build is acceptable. And once you have those type of tests in, now you can measure how many acceptable builds are going out to the dev environment. So the testability report tells us it's probably good to get on and start testing this build. So let's get it to the next environment. The acceptance report says we're continuing development of these features and we haven't broken anything that's already been implemented. And the third related report that's kind of a metric is releasability report. Now, let me be very specific on this one. I'm not talking about an indicator that the release is complete. When I say it's release ready or it's releasable, I'm talking about whether putting that out in production, we might shoot ourselves in the foot. Even if we have incomplete features, even if we have some things that aren't quite working right, I at least want to make sure we have not introduced risk. At least do the best job I can to mitigate. We have not introduced any risk to regulatory compliance, revenue generation, or our reputation. Reputation's the easy one. You misspell your company's name on the front page, or you put the wrong company logo in. Okay, something very ridiculous. You're going to get flamed on X. Okay, that's probably a good way to put it. You don't want to release anything like that. Regulatory compliance, that takes due diligence of the team and maybe a specialist on the team who keeps them aware of, for each user story, what things we need to consider when it comes to regulations. Let's put a test in and make sure we haven't broken that. And revenue generation, of course, sometimes takes a little thought. Not everything is revenue impacting, okay, but really considering whether the change we're making introduces risk to revenue generation. If it does, let's put a quick little functional test in for that bit of functionality, include it in our releasability report or our release ready suite of tests. That's a great indicator that you're always ready to release to production. You can measure that now, the quality of what you're doing and the result of it. You can measure that now, whether this code's releasable all the time. You can do it by percentage or a number, but that is a measurement of quality, built-in quality, that we've truly built the quality in and it's ready to go. If you put all of those together, those three test suites, if you will, a testability suite, I call it a smoke suite, an acceptability suite, the acceptance suite, and a releasability suite, release ready suite. So if you put those all together, I actually include those in one test suite called deployment validation. So we want every deployment to that dev environment to pass that deployment validation suite. That's what we're looking for. I will replace those three other metrics without just simple overriding one. If any three of those fail, we're not going to deploy. We're not going to put it in the test environment. We're not going to have people test something that can't be released anyway. So we're going to shortcut that, make sure we're using people's time valuably. So if any of the deployment validation tests fail, any of the tests in those three suites, we want to stop, fix it, get it redeployed, and move forward. So that one test suite gives you an indicator right there on that first environment, the dev environment, whether anybody else now can work on it. We have made sure that the developers are doing quality work on what they're doing so everybody else can do their job well. Because you do still have testing that's going to be happening in each of the different environments in the pipeline, and you have some manual testing that's going to be going on. You want to make sure that the developer hasn't introduced something that now is going to cause them to have to start all over again after they've spent a lot of time in testing. So that deployment validation suite does that, and that measurement of the percentage or number of builds that pass the deployment validation, that's a good metric to know. Are we doing well? Have we built quality in? That's what we're looking for. One that is probably the biggest impact I see when I go into organizations, and they usually will, whatever I came into their organization to do, they ask me to spend a lot of time on this one thing, and that is related around how we measure how a team is doing. Okay. Oftentimes we use burn down when we're evaluating a team, or we use velocity in terms of story point velocity. Really, those two numbers, the burn down and the velocity especially that we use now, is only the business of the team. It only benefits them. For anybody else, it becomes a management number, and that's not a good place to be in. When you're managing a team or using their metrics to manage them or help them manage themselves, that's not a good place to be in. That's not an indicator of quality. And so we try to give the business something else to measure, and something that makes sense. So what I try to encourage them to do is to measure what I call user story velocity or feature velocity. Okay? How many user stories on average does a team get done per iteration over the past 5 iterations? Let me explain that real quick. By doing the average over the past 5, I don't worry about the fact that we had holidays or days off, or we were really successful in one iteration and really poor in another. I just average it out over the past 5. Not over the life of the team, because that's too much variance, just over the past 5, the most recent past 5 iterations. Whatever that number is, that's what the business should reasonably expect the team to deliver for this iteration. Not expect. Be careful not to manage or drive or guilt or shame your team into delivering that same number. It's for you to do planning. So no, okay, I can expect that from them. A couple of notes on that. Some things that can really mess that number up is if your especially if your teams are divided into back-end and front-end teams. And so there's one feature, but there's back-end work and front-end work. So we got 2 different user stories. Okay, those 2 user stories together are a feature delivered. How do you measure that? Well, that just becomes a problem. So if you want your number to be reliable and accurate, you probably should consider restructuring your teams. That's also going to improve your quality too. If you have one team where you have a specialist in the back end, a specialist in the front end, one user story, different tasks, and the team works the stories that way, now when the user story comes through, it's an indicator of a complete feature that came through. Another one I see often is we have something that needs to be hooked up or taken care of, and we write a user story for it. But it's not really a user story, it's a task. It's we needed to hook something up. We needed to connect to a third-party system or whatever, and we call it a user story. It's not a user story. It's a task. What I encourage folks to do is if there is a user story anywhere in the current iteration for which that task is related, put it as a task of that user story. Even if it's in another team somewhere, it doesn't matter. It just needs to get done. Why are we worried so much about who did it and accounting for that. We don't want to do Gantt charts and micromanage everybody's time. It just, look, if it needs to be done and this guy over here has to do it and he's on a different team, it's okay, just put it as the task over there. He'll get it done, mark off the task. It's part of that user story. Now, when your stories get delivered, you get a better indication of reliably how many user stories you can expect from different teams and from your organization on a cadence. You can do planning with that, much better planning, without expecting everybody to track things in a special way and make sure they update everything properly and all that kind of stuff. Who cares about that? I'm just going to look at what did get done. Nobody has to do any extra activity for me to do that. What did get done, average it over the past 5 iterations, and I get that number. By the way, one practice which we need to be much better at is user story refinement. We are so bad at that. Improving that practice improves this number, which results in better throughput, which results in great numbers when they look at user story velocity. System coverage. Okay. I want to know, as a business owner, you could tell me you have full code coverage. You could tell me you've run every one of test coverage usually is number of tests executed or which tests of all of our tests, which ones got run. Test coverage. I want to know how much of my system got tested, not that somebody manually marked off which ones got tested. I want, especially if it's automated, I want the automation to generate a report that tells me, here's how much of our system got covered. It doesn't have to be 100%, but at least give me an idea of what it looks like. Okay? Especially if that report also includes what those parts of the system are, what tests were executed, and what data scenarios were used for each test execution. That level of granularity in a report like that at least is available in a report like that, is great for business. Man, now I don't have to go and try to find the person that has the information and trust that they're giving me the right stuff. I can look at the report that their automation generated, and I know for sure what's going on there. So system coverage report. How much of my system got covered? I usually keep it simple. Web pages, web service endpoints. Okay, I just keep it real simple. This is all the tests related to that page. This is all the tests related to that endpoint. Okay, I keep them subject oriented. Not requirements or function or feature oriented. Keep them based on what the systems look like. Requirements coverage. Of course, I want to know, did you test all the requirements that were part of this particular release? I want to see the requirement numbers, and I want to see the tests executed to cover that requirement and the test data scenarios used in executing those tests. I want to be able to look at and confirm for myself that you say you covered the requirement. I want to see it. And I may actually say, hey, you did a great job, but you missed one scenario. I might be able to do that now in looking at a report like that. So that's one thing to measure is requirements coverage. Now, those you can get a percentage. You can figure it out. Sometimes you have to do that manually. You could create automation around it. It's probably cost more than it's worth. But you can do a quick eyeball check of which requirements got covered and which ones were in that release and identify where there's a gap and kind of look into it. So that report is very valuable to know that our inspection was done well. Okay, so do you measure how well you do an inspection? Yes. But the full set of inspection happens after all the quality is built in, and then we're building that out into the environments. So we do measure the quality of our inspection, but we measure it in that way. We're looking at the amount of system got covered, amount of the requirements got covered. We're not looking in all these other numbers that currently we look at to make sure we're doing testing in an efficient, effective way. We just do the testing and find out how much of our system, how much of our requirements got covered. That doesn't mean to say, by the way, if you notice that testing is taking 2 or 3 days, and you would really like to get it down to half an hour, that's not worth looking into. It is. But I didn't need a report to tell me how long the tests ran. I know it's too long. Let's figure out a way to introduce parallel execution. Let's improve our test data management and acquisition. Let's improve our system security, loosen things up a little bit, be able to do a little bit more, negotiate some of those things. so that we can achieve the much faster throughput on the testing. I don't need metrics to tell me where we're at, because most of the time, even though I see the metric, I can't change it. There's nothing I can do. So instead, my thumb hurts, I go take care of it and fix it. Well, if that's a pain point for you, go fix it. Now, with all of these numbers, that's a good point that I didn't make earlier. But if you're going to measure something, put it out there for everybody to see it. Don't have it in some notes for the leadership to look at. You're not going to influence and motivate and empower change by your organization by just keeping it to the leadership's eyes. I've had places that had huge monitors where every one of the metrics was up there on the board. And sometimes it was red lights and green lights. There's graphs that would turn red and green or blue based on certain numbers that were there. You see the graph, but all of a sudden it would snap red. You go, oh, something bad happened. So putting those numbers that you care about, those measurements that you care about, up for everybody to see. And then I would assume that everybody's looking at them. In other words, bringing it up in conversation as if everybody saw it already. Don't expect it. Don't demand it. Don't force it. Just assume it. Just assume everybody's looking. Those are important numbers. I'm looking at them. And if leadership is looking at them, your people will start to look at them. When they know you care about them and you're paying attention to them, your people are going to start paying attention to them and care about them. They'll come up with innovative solutions, especially if you're using a great agile practice, probably the best one, true effective retrospectives. Doing effective retrospectives, you will start seeing change because people are taking this information they're seeing and they're taking action on it because they want to see an improvement in those numbers. So I hope this was helpful. My recommendation is to be reconciled to a built-in quality approach to measuring how you're doing it, building quality in, how you're doing in those development principles, practices, and patterns, and reduce or eliminate your metrics that are around how well you're doing it, inspecting the software or the results of the inspection of the software.